Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this Mountaineers Books web event as part of our Be Well virtual series. Tonight's digital event is Boundless Brothers, Stories We Live By, and will feature a dialogue between author Hank Lentfer and David James Duncan to speak about their life-changing friendships with Richard K. Nelson and fellow author Brian Doyle, respectively. My name is Erica Lundahl. I'm the Conservation Impact Manager for Mountaineers Books and Braided River. Mountaineers Books is located on Duwamish and Coast Salish territories in Seattle, Washington. And our books about the outdoors tell stories across the lands of hundreds, if not thousands, of Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the place-based knowledge of these people and are grateful for their ancestral and current stewardship of these lands that we cherish so dearly. Tonight's event is hosted by Mountaineers Books, a nonprofit publisher of award-winning books about the outdoors, conservation, and sustainability lifestyle for the last 60 years. We could not be more honored to be the publisher of Hank Lentfer's book, Raven's Witness, a biography about the life and teachings of natural history author and anthropologist Richard K. Nelson, or Nels as many called him, perhaps most well known for his book, The Island Within. I know we have people joining us today from all over the world who knew Nels, and we're so glad you could be here to help us celebrate his life and Brian Doyle's. I'd also like to say thank you to Orion Magazine for being our community partner for this event. Orion Magazine invites readers into a community of caring for the planet. Through writing and art that explores the connection between nature and culture, Orion inspires new thinking about humanity and how we might live on Earth justly, sustainably, and joyously. I'd also like to offer a special thank you to Tom and Sonia Campion, who have supported the conservation impact programming for this book. As a 501c3 mission nonprofit, Mountaineers Books, we invest in and bring to life powerful books and stories like Raven's Witness that connect and root us deeply in the natural world. We're supported by a combination of book sales and philanthropic support. For today's event, feel free to use the chat feature if you have questions for David or Hank, and we'll be monitoring them as we go. And on that note, I am so delighted to introduce you to both Hank and to David. Hank Lentfer is a lifelong Alaskan and intimately familiar with much of the country that Nels wrote about. Close friends with Nels, their relationship centered on a mutual love of wild country, conservation, and writing. The idea for Raven's Witness lodged in Lentfer's mind years ago as he and Nels spent a late September day on the water in Glacial Bay recording glacier calving. A biologist by training, Lentfer currently works as a sound recordist and part-time land steward for the Nature Conservancy. He's the author of Faith of Cranes, Finding Hope and Family in Alaska, and lives in Gustavus, Alaska. I'd also love to introduce you to David James Duncan, the author of 4 works of nonfiction and the novels The River Wye, The Brothers K, and the forthcoming Sun House. His work has appeared in over 40 anthologies, including the Pushcart Prizes, Best American Sports Writing, Best American Essays, and Best American Spiritual Writing. All right, and with that, I'm handing the reins over to you, David and Hank.
All right.
Hear me? Hey, Hank.
Yes, we are.
Thanks, Erica.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Listening to those ravens, listening to those ravens at the intro there reminds me that I sent raven calls to Brian years ago, and he wrote back that they sounded like stoned clowns. So he was always quick with a fun reply.
Yeah, he had the stone clown routine down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if I can figure out the technology, Erica mentioned this trip years ago. It's probably 15 years ago. And And hopefully you can all see this amazing glacier. And I'm in that blue boat. Nels is pulling that red one ashore. My buddy Jake Jacoby's walking there. And my other buddy Kim Hecox took this photo. And we were in Glacier Bay. Nels was working. The rest of us were just purely goofing off. He was recording radio programs, which were all meticulously prepped. And here he is reviewing his notes before recording a live to tape radio program on tidewater glaciers. And here he is paddling closer than most anybody would dare up to the face of this calving glacier. And I'm going to play just a very short piece from the radio program that came out of this trip.
I happen to be sitting about 100 yards from the face of this glacier on a beautiful sunny afternoon at the cusp between summer and fall. It's warm, the warm sun on my back, and right straight in front of me is one of the biggest, coldest things you could ever find anywhere on Earth. Not only that, but on both sides of me is a mountain scene that would just explode your eyeballs. It is positively incredible.
So that, that clip ended right as you're probably getting hooked into it, and it goes on for another 30 minutes at that intensity, even building of enthusiasm. And the enthusiasm captured in that recording could not match the enthusiasm in this man's being when he paddled back to the bigger boat, to the skiff. And as he came within shouting distance, he set his paddle down and just screamed, "This is the best freaking day of my life." And that, I'd heard him say that the day before on top of a mountain with mountain goats. I heard him say it the day before that after following a black bear along a salmon stream. And it was startling almost to be in the presence of a guy who was truly having the best day of his life repeatedly, and this man is in his mid 60s at this point. And it didn't take long being in his presence to realize, man, I want to drink whatever he's drinking. And I had an opportunity after this trip to spend a lot of time in places like this with him. And so the question of how do you keep living that intensely and with that much joy, the short answer is attentiveness. He was just so fiercely tuned and focused on the world around him, and it's a trait that he shared with Doyle as well. So I'm going to toss it to you, David.
All right. Well, since it's my task to speak of Brian and Hank's to speak of his free-range friend, Nels, I'll begin with one of the magic ingredients that I feel joins the two, but it's probably the same thing we're going to be saying all night. This is what Hank was just saying, but in the very different lens. Brian's and my friendship was literary, spiritual, and Brian liked to think genetically Celtic, so he would not say frick, he would say feck, F-E-C-K. That was his version of the word, Hank, as I'm sure you know. Anyway, both of them speak with unabashed skill and gratitude about the unseen as they experienced it. So when Mountaineers asked me for words for Raven's Witness, I didn't waste time trying to be original. I bowed to Nels' love for the profoundly aboriginal and headed straight for what Raven's actual witness, Nels himself, shows us with Hank's astoundingly skillful help. A man who allowed the unavoidable wisdom of an ancient culture and wild place that caused him to evolve from being an anthropologist by training into a joy-struck participant in a sentient and seeing world, these are his words, in which no one is ever alone, unseen, or unheard, and gratitude kindles the very heat of life. To distinguish our friends, it's remarkable that Brian finds the same joy-struck state countless times, but I'm going to talk about a time he immersed himself in an essay about the trial of William Blake and labored heroically on it for more than a year and arrived at a litany of Blake's qualities that also might be the best portrait anyone's written of Brian himself and touches on many traits of Nels as well. Why do I love Blake so? Brian asks himself. Because he was a tender and difficult and solicitous friend. Because he saw angels and saints and talked openly about his visions. Because he took great pride in his engravings and worked endlessly on plates to make them perfect. Because when he knew he was going to die, he lay in his bed singing softly. Because he smiled at the deft poetry of the message when his wife served him an empty plate at dinner to remind him that they were starving. Because he wasn't satisfied with the mythology of his day and so built a vast, grand, impenetrable one of his own. Because of all the, where is he going to find Make Prayers to the Raven in the British Empire? Because in all the things he wrote, he never mentioned his weight, which was ample, or his height, which was not. Because in the few drawings of him, he is alert, intent, attentive. Because even when his work was dictated whole to him by angels and prophets, he edited heavily. That is so Brian. Because he and his wife used to sit naked in their garden and recite passages from Paradise Lost. Because he wrote and then threw away what he called 6 or 7 epic poems as long as Homer and 20 tragedies as long as Macbeth, judging them not worthy of publication. Because he taught his wife, a farmer's daughter, to read. Because he rose first every morning and laid the fire and made tea for her. Because he was endlessly exuberant. Because once at dinner, he suddenly said to the child next to him, "May God make this world as beautiful to you as it has been to me." A sentence she remembered for the rest of her life.
I'm going to read
Oh, great.
a piece from this book that David put together of Brian's writing. And this is from a poem called A Shrew. And in the beginning of this, he just does this great description of an encountering and just focusing on this fierce, teeny little guy. And he concludes with, all these years later, that's what I remember from that shrewish moment, that I stopped thinking and just stared. Yes, partly because I was scared, but there was something beyond curiosity or the startle of astonishment. For just an instant, I paid attention with every shard and iota of my being. Maybe we couldn't survive if we were like that all the time. I don't know. But when it happens, we see that which none of us can find words for. Sometimes we are starving to see every bit of what is right in front of us. And that hunger to see fully as humanly possible that which is right in front of us, I know propelled Nels through the world. And I'm going to read a piece from his personal journal where he speaks to that when he writes, Closeness is the sacred power I seek. My amulet comes by moving within the touch of eyes, mingling scents, reaching out with my fingers toward feathers ruffled by the same wind gust that surrounds us both. I ask no blood from the eagle, no feathers. Only look at me. Let me hear breath wheezing through your beak, the ticking of your quills, the scuffling of your feet on dry bark. Let me feel the rushing air beneath the rhythm of your wing beats. So again, just that fierce attentiveness, and both these men, such exquisite storytellers in different forms of writing, but their storytelling could only rise to the place it got to through this fierce attentiveness. So that listening and observation was the root of their brilliance.
And you ready for me to say a few words? I would say with Brian too, the equivalent of the time you spent outside was his absolute voraciousness for all kinds of literature. And to create a writer that great, it takes a lot of books. And the same attentiveness was being applied to those. I also want to say it was, I was editor-in-chief of One Long River of Song, so I deserve the blame for the mistakes, but I had two magnificent helpers. Chip Blake of Orion fame, now a freelance editor who you would be very lucky to work with, as I was when he recently edited my new novel, Sun House. I saw a little message appear to Erica that might be mentioning that it was identified in the graphic to open as Sun Horse, and I'm fine with that. Don't feel bad. Sun House, but don't feel bad. I don't even know if that's what the message was about. Anyway, Brian and I were friends for a lot of years before our friendship ramped up to something that really felt truly like brotherhood. And the chief chemistry of that change was gratitude, but honesty had to come first. And so, strange to say, did a hell of a lot of editing. Brian would find long essays of mine published various places, often in the Sun magazine or Orion, but elsewhere too. And he would pluck 1,000 words from them and send what he had done to me, unbeknownst to me. And I'd be looking at 1,000 words that were very well said and made a powerful point and left out the 9 other points I'd made in a gigantic essay. And he'd offer me $1,000 to keep me going, keep my family going. And 4 times his 1,000-word, I called them pellets, or also spiritual hatchet jobs, but his brief versions ended up in Best American Spiritual Writing, so I got paid twice and got the little feather in my cap of that, when in fact it was Brian. Anyway, Brian had a dogged belief born of his adoration of his father, James Aloysius Doyle, who may in truth have been the single most admirable father of any of my close friends. But he turned the fact that his father wrote essays into his own belief that the essay is the single greatest form of all writing. And he was not circumspect about his opinion, even after I'd published The River Y and The Brothers K, which didn't exactly flop. He pitched me shit about wasting time on fiction. I once got irked enough to say, shall we briefly talk sales, your essays versus the fiction, and see if maybe fiction might pay you a little better? And that just caused him to faint and flatter my essays, which he liked publishing in Portland, his magazine, because essays by a bunch of us, wonderful writers he hauled in, Peter Matheson, Harry Tempest Williams, Mary Oliver. I'm just going to leave out way too many of my friends. I shouldn't have started. But Barry Lopez, and great writers you've never heard of, to develop a genre that later became known in a famous blurb by Annie Dillard as spiritual writing. She called Portland the best spiritual writing publication in the country, and at that point she said that it was. Anyway, Brian loved Portland as much as he loved his father almost, so our friendship didn't turn into a brotherhood until he began secretly writing a novel, which brings us to gratitude. In 2009, wait a minute, I have to stop for 1 second and mention the other editor of One Long River of Song is my dear friend, Katie Yale, who still works for Orion and was an unbelievable resource for the, I can't do her justice. I just love her and loved her help. And so 3 people created this book that's done so well. So in 2009, he said something about spending time on a novel and wondered if I'd talk to him about wild salmon, steelhead, and cutthroat in Oregon coast streams and what it feels like to spend huge amounts of time on them. So I let him have it with both barrels. And a short time later, he told me he'd finished a draft of his novel and was I curious enough to see it. Well, a novel by a lifelong fecking essayist. And damn it, I love the guy, so I'd have to find something nice to say. Then the first draft of Mink River crossed my transom, and I was so smitten by its County Tillamook meets County Sligo Irishness and indigenousness and musicality that I offered to read the manuscript as mercilessly as I do my own. A favor perhaps worthy of the many he'd done for me. He always said the same thing if he was really happy with a proposal. Sweet Jesus, yes! And hard work was followed by a 3-hour morning phone call that was purely editorial and at the same time the most fun I ever had pen in hand with another writer. It shocked me that Brian never questioned any of the scores of changes I threw at him. I just heard scrawling and a bunch of yep, got it, yep, yep, okay. An East Coaster and I then fell silent and found ourselves marveling at a Pacific Northwest classic so realized you could harvest its shellfish, get sopped in its rain, and find agates gleaming on the low tide beaches of its pages. Then came publication, success, and gratitude, and nobody did grateful like Brian, James, Patrick, Doyle. This thing here is the only hardcover copy of Mink River in existence. And the author, it says, is Patty Doyle. Brian liked it when I called him that in the blurb I wrote for the book. And so he kept it going. He used Trappist bookbinders to make the book at a monastery that I visited almost annually since I was 18. Then he signed it with prayers and laughter and added a note. Yeah, can't see it. I'll just read what he said. Man, thank you. Not only for the glorious, headlong, hilarious, heartfelt blurb, but far more for the real, actual, no shit guidance and help and assistance and editing and honest, absolute, genuine caring about this book. A book that was huge for me in a million ways, and even more than that, for years of genuine, funny, honest, deep, cool, endlessly entertaining, spiritual, literary, masculine, Celtic, Western friendship. Your friendship has been an ocean of grace and laughter to me, really one of the great gifts of my shambling years as a man of the West. 26 modifiers in that 90-word gratitude bomb. Every word more true of Brian than of me, and a friendship like that wasn't just a pleasure. We enjoyed reminding each other that we're just a couple of dirtbags like all the rest, but from almost the day we met, we begin to experience, without overtly talking it to death, a flame in each of us that we could always find burning in the other. A flame we held to be inextinguishable. And I've had the pleasure of being warmed by the same flame, talking with Hank about his brotherhood with Raven's man, Nels.
So in the introduction to One Long River, David, you mentioned that much of what you talked about with Brian had very little social or spiritual redeeming value whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah, during work doldrums, yeah, we would just let our hair down and let it all hang out. Usually sports were involved. Go ahead.
And Nels and I spent so much time camping and boating together. And if you had just a nonstop recording of all those hours, and you hired a set of interns to listen to them all to try and pull out the pieces with any social or spiritually redeeming value, you might get a full 20 minutes out of the 25 years we spent together. So
I'm hoping you're going to give us a sample of this wordlessness.
Well, I'm going to give you a sample of something that I can share with an audience that I can't see. So many of our days started in the wee hours before the sun came up. We'd crawl from the tent, and our passion was just listening. He just taught me how to use this recording gear and the beauty of listening, which really was a meditation. You just go out, turn on this exquisite microphone, and let these birds and wind and streams just pour through your head. And when you do that morning after morning, day after day, without coming back to town and plugging into all the crap that streams through our screens, well, it has an effect on you. And I'm just going to share. So after about day 5, something like this would happen a couple times a day.
Oh, that hurt. Oh, God. Tears running down my face.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it was I'm going to try and follow that with a Mary Oliver poem that speaks so wonderfully to both Brian and Nels. It's called Mysteries, Yes, by Mary Oliver. Truly, we live with mysteries too marvelous to be understood. How grass can be nourishing in the mouths of the lambs. How rivers and stones are forever in allegiance with gravity, while we ourselves dream of rising. How 2 hands touch and the bonds will never be broken. How people come from delight or the scars of damage to the comfort of a poem. Let me keep my distance always from those who think they have answers. Let me keep my company always with those who say, look, and laugh with astonishment and bow their heads. So that last line again, let me keep company with those who say, look, and laugh with astonishment and bow their heads. That is the company that David found with Brian. that is the company I found with Nels. And that is the company that my growing friendship with David here, the experience with our friends and writing, shepherding another piece of their work into the world as they were actively dying is something that's brought David and I together. And so we lost that company, and we're finding it in each other now. And that's just an element of this notion of boundless brothers. And the other idea that boundlessness is both of these men really had innate knack for just seeing through all these divisions we tend to hinder our vision of the world with. And they could just blur those boundaries and see the commonality between people and species and creatures and impulses. And it was it's just a gift to us as their friends and a gift to all their readers that they took the time to put this on the page.
Thinking of Brian's laughter. He ran a lecture series at University of Portland that was funded by a really eccentric and sweet old priest, Art Schoenfeld. The Schoenfeld lectures brought in many of the writers we've already mentioned to Portland, and it was a good paying gig. Mary Oliver came, Peter Matheson came, Barry Lopez, again, the same list that you saw in all the pieces, the beautiful pieces that were in various anthologies from Portland Magazine. And Brian and I were close, and he cheated. He cheated with the Schoenfeld lecture because, unlike Hank and Nels, we lived far apart. We lived 560 miles apart. He was working on the bluff over the Willamette, University of Portland. I was working in my study on Lolo Creek, and we didn't get to see each other nearly as much as we wanted to. So when everybody else was getting invited to give one Schoenfeld lecture, I was invited to give 4 over the course of 20 years. And it really wasn't fair, but every once in a while, you know, something that's not fair is a delight, and I'll take it. So my 25th wedding anniversary was coming up, and my wife and daughter had been in a, polite word, no, I won't be polite, a junk shop in Lincoln City, Oregon on the coast. And they'd come upon a little dollhouse that had a figure in it sitting at a desk who looked remarkably like me when I had a goatee. And when it was time to get a wedding present, anniversary present, I purchased this guy despite the ridiculous price and sent him to my daughter Ellie, who's a skilled jeweler, and gave him a pair of circular glasses, like the ones I wear all day. And so Tiny David began to have ridiculous adventures, like holding on to the neck of a bottle of bourbon trying to open the lid, or wandering outside, getting into a horrible sculpture a poet friend of mine had made that every summer would become infested with paper wasps. Or in one photo, he's sitting on a large toadstool. He's like 8 inches tall. He's sitting on a toadstool. And Brian took the photo of Tiny David on a toadstool and made it the author photo in the program at the 4th Schoenfeld lecture that I was in. And as people were walking in, I was sitting with Brian in the front, and they would look down at Brian, and they'd look at me, and he'd look at the program, and then they'd look at me again, and then they'd look at me again, and Brian was weeping with laughter. People trying to figure out how the hell I found a toadstool big enough to pose on for the Schoenfeld lectures, where Barry and Peter and Mary Oliver had held forth. It was a great moment. A quick story about another of Brian's great loves that led to a great moment, his love for basketball. Erica, can we get the picture of the Dalai Lama at University of Portland by any chance? See what happens here. I can continue anyway, but if she can find that, it'd be fun to look at. So it's May of 2013. His Holiness is at the University of Portland and a security team is spending hours. Ah, there we go. Great. Oh, look at this. Somebody who knows tech. Very nice. Oh, perfect. Thank you. There he is, and that was the day. Before he got to this point, we don't know where he was, but Brian was waiting for a security team that was spending hours inspecting 5,000 incoming Dalai Lama fans at the Child Center at the university for possible dangers to the Dalai Lama. Of course, they have to do that. Brian, meanwhile, had slipped into the quiet of an anteroom that was lined full with cases full of athletic trophies to wait it out. And as he was reminiscing about various great teams, he was especially fond of the fantastic women's soccer teams that University of Portland has fielded for years. A monk wandered in, a Tibetan monk wandered into the room and immediately was drawn to the trophies. And he turned to Brian and said, "What have these men and women done to merit all these golden shrines?" Brian explained that they were athletes. The monk and writer discovered a shared love of sports. And within seconds, they began arguing over whether soccer or basketball is the superior game. Brian was delighted with the monk's debating style and his resounding laugh, but hoop is hoop and Brian is Brian. And when the monk remained hoop proof, Brian heated up enough to toss a fraught little phrase at him. Comparing 4 accounts of this moment, 2 of them Brian's own, I can't say for sure whether he said, "Hey, listen up, pal," or "Now hold on there, bub." But there's no controversy in the fact that shortly after Brian hurled the phrase, an entourage of monks and Secret Service filed into the room. The monks reverently encircled Brian's antagonist, and Brian realized he'd been hammering like a barroom sports junkie on the most revered spiritual figure of our time. The aftermath of the debate was positive for both men. Having spent a life buried under honorific titles, His Holiness delighted in being considered a pal or a bub for a moment. And Brian was so contrite that he couldn't stop marveling that the global compassion hero continued to love soccer as much as he did as did the dirt poor village kids of Tibet. I wish I had time to read His Holiness the Dalai Lama manifestation, full title, Brian title. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, manifestation of Chenrezig, Bodhisattva of compassion, stops the car along the road to watch children play soccer. You would see if I did how far the one-time essayist came in his journey into the beauty of not just fiction, but Tibetan folk mythology. But I'm going to do a feint and return to Brian's love of basketball and a piece he wrote, I think hoping maybe His Holiness would find it one day and perhaps conclude that his love of soccer and Brian's love of basketball ended in a glorious tie. But first, please, Hank and Nels.
I'm going to read something from the Dalai Lama after that.
Great.
This is from the Book of Joy. And the Dalai Lama is quoted as saying, "Remember, you are not alone. And you do not need to finish the work. It helps no one if you sacrifice your joy because others are suffering. We people who care must be attractive, must be filled with joy so that others recognize that caring, that helping, and being generous are not a burden. They are a joy. Give the world your love, your service, your healing, but also give it your joy. This too is a great gift.
Wow. Good find. We didn't rehearse this, folks.
No, we didn't.
That's amazing. You ready for the basketball story?
Yeah.
Erica, could we see the Pied Piper with a classroom full of ecstatic young scholars digging for buried treasure, not in their heart or their innermost soul, but in their own nostrils? Sorry to do this to you, but it's just, talk about joy. Oh, man. Nice. Thank you, Erica. This is so great. I've never worked like this with a skilled tech person. So anyway, you can see that the kids are ecstatic. And let me tell you off camera, the teacher of the class was very much not so. But Brian was Brian, and his love for kids was inseparable from his gigantic love of children, beginning with his own children. And here's the piece that I think might have caused, or might one day cause, the Dalai Lama to admit that it's a tie between soccer and basketball. 2-on-2. Once upon a time, a long time ago, I rambled through thickets of brawny power forwards and quicksilver cocksure guards and rooted ancient centers, trying to slide smoothly to the hoop, trying to find space in the crowd to get off my shot, trying to maneuver at high speed with the ball around corners and hips and sudden angry elbows, the elbows of 20 years of men in grade school, high school, college, the park, the playground, the men's league, the noon league, the summer league. Men as high as the 7-foot center I met violently during a summer league game. Men as able as the college and professional players I was hammered by in playgrounds. Men as fierce as the fellow who once took off his sweats and laid a shotgun down by his cap before he trotted onto the court. I got hurt, as most everyone does eventually. I got hurt enough to quit. Back pains, back surgery, more surgeries. It was quit or walk. Now I walk. The game receded, fell away, a part of me sliding into the dark like a rocket stage, no longer part of the mission. Now I'm married, and here come my children. My lovely dark-haired, thoughtful daughter, and 3 years later, my squirming twin electric sons. And now my daughter is 4 and my sons are 1 each. And yesterday, my daughter and I played 2-on-2 against my sons on the lovely burnished oak floor of our dining room. The boys who just learned to walk, staggering across the floor like drunken sailors and falling at the slightest touch. My daughter, loud, lanky, in her orange socks, sliding from place to place without benefit of a dribble, but there's no referee, only me on my knees, dribbling behind my back, dribbling through the plump legs of my sons, their diapers sagging, daughter shrieking with glee, boys confused and excited. And I'm weeping, weeping, weeping in love with my perfect magic children, with the feel of the bright red plastic tiny balls spinning in my hands, my arms at home in the old motions, my head and shoulders snapping fakes on the boys who laugh. I lean long for a loose ball near the dining room table and shuffle so slowly on my knees toward the toy basket, 8 feet, a mile, 100 miles away. My children brushing knees toward my children butt brushing against my thighs and shoulders like dreams, like birds. Joey staggers toward me, reaches for the ball. I wrap it around my back to my left hand, which picks up rapid dribble. Joey loses balance and grabs my hair. Lily slides by suddenly and cuts Joe cleanly away. He takes hairs with him as he and Lily disappear in a tangle of limbs and laughs. A terrific moving pick. I would stop to admire it, but here comes big Liam, lumbering along toward the ball as alluring and bright as the sun. Crossover dribble back to my right hand. Liam drops like a stone, spins on his bottom to stay with the play. I palm the ball, show fake, and lean into a short fall away from 4 feet away. Ball hits rim of basket, bounces straight up in the air. Lily slides back into the picture and grabs my right hand, but I lean east and with the left, catch and slam the ball into the basket all in one motion, and it bounces off a purple plastic duck and rolls away again under the table, and I lie there on the floor as Joe yanks at my left sock and Lily sits on my chest and Liam ever so gently, so meticulously, so daintily takes off my glasses, and I am happier than I have ever been.
I'm going to read a couple sentences from a piece from Brian called Rapturous. And he had a deep love, in addition to his children, for anything to do with a raptor. So he's made a play here on the word rapture and raptor. And he concludes this short piece. Maybe what the word rapture really means is an attention so ferocious that you see the miracle of the world as the miracle it is. Maybe that is what happens to saints and mystics who float up into the air and soar beyond sight and vanish finally into the glare of the sun. And then here's a piece from Nels's journal. Written a full 25 years before he died. If anything remains for me when I die, it should be left on Cruzoff Island, where my bones can crumble into that soil and my atoms mingle with the muskeg and moss and lava. There could be no better afterlife for me than to become part of the island, to run through the blood of deer and flow in the muskeg ponds, to fly over the high peaks in the feathers of eagles, to soak with rains into the deep sphagnum. Raven, take my eyes and see with them. Wind, take my breath and sing with it. Hemlock, take my flesh and grow tall with it. Island, take my soul and twist it together with your own.
Amen.
Yeah.
Erica, we're ready for questions, I think. I can't do better than that.
Thank you so much. That was, it's amazing to hear this dialogue between really the four of you, kind of bouncing back and forth in this collage of what it means to be alive right now. We just got a question from TJ King saying, Hank, I really enjoyed the story of Gary Snyder's visit to Alaska and the time on the island with Nels. Are there any other anecdotes of their interactions? Did they maintain correspondence over the subsequent years?
This bone is one that Gary Snyder picked out of the moss on Cruzoff Island. So Nels and Gary were hiking together and they found scattered bones and this bone was shattered and it's healed. So this little piece here was sticking out of the skin and these two men spent most of an afternoon just studying this bone and thinking about the yearning of the world to heal. And they left that bone in the moss. And Nels went back to it over the years. He would find it, dust it off, and he eventually took it home, hung it on his office wall, and it hangs on mine now. And when I was writing Raven's Witness, I called Gary and had a wonderful conversation with him, and he remembers that day with Nels vividly.
That's great.
that and Nels in his journals was an awe to be on the island with Gary, and he writes about how well Gary articulated so much that Nels was just trying to bring into focus for himself. And Gary, when I called him, said many of the same things about Nels. So there was a brotherhood there. And they didn't spend, they certainly saw each other. Nels went down and visited Gary in California a few times. But there was definitely a deep brotherhood there.
We had another question that came in. Says, in this moment in time, there's so much divisiveness in our politics, in our culture. Are there things that you've learned from Brian or Hank that you think are really essential tools to help us heal?
Go ahead.
Actually, David, I heard you say this in a public forum once. I think you were still on the stage, that you said it was artistically immoral to talk about hard things without humor. And Nels was the funniest man I've ever been with. Although there's not a stitch of humor in his writing, on the stage he was funny, and in person he was hilarious. And just thank all the gods that have ever been for the fact that there's humor in our lives.
I feel it's really important to reach out to our people, whoever our closest people are, again and again, even if it's reduced by the inability to touch them or breathe the same air as them, to seek to touch base with them. I'm fortunate to have a wonderful circle of friends, and I don't know what I'd be doing without them. Just in terms of, social distancing come evening is fucking lonely. and having a short list of people who, if it's just getting to you and you just need to hear a human voice. Thinking of Gary, I can't help but think of his love for Dogen's, the father of Soto Zen, his love for Mountains and Waters Sutra, which I read at least once a year. Dogen says that mountains are enlightened teachers of the Dharma if we pay close attention to them. And how far is that from the teachings of Nels' native mentors? I also think of, this is a river tooth. I almost brought it out when Hank was talking about the deer bone, because it's a similar kind of iconography. This thing was part of an ancient Sitka spruce, and all that's left when these things break down over many, many, many years are the point where the limb joins the trunk, and the sap content is so high that if I cut into this thing, it would look more like glass than wood. And these last, I think they last thousands of years. I found this one on the Salmon River estuary, the Oregon Salmon River, and it had been buried in the tidal muck. And I wouldn't be surprised if this is as old as the Buddha Dharma. And another friend gave me this, which is a Southeast Asian Buddha icon. And we had a better image here. I don't know if you can see it, but these two guys look like each other. And there is a close resemblance. This one, the tooth almost has a face. Brian's older sister is a Buddhist monk. Brian argued sports with the Dalai Lama, who's a living repository of a wisdom tradition. And man, if you're feeling down, the conversation between Archbishop Tutu and the Dalai Lama in the Book of Joy that Hank was quoting from, if that can't cheer you, I don't know what will. And just, I know we all feel threat in the current situation, and there's a biological need to track a threat, but there is a profound psycho-spiritual need to stay in touch with the most ancient, true things that have ever been said and done by human beings. And I'm part of a circle of friends that's so self-giving compared to anybody that you will ever see on even the best news stations, which are litanies of horror a lot of the time. And to spend time with what is as ancient and true as the desire to live of that deer, and as these two very different icons, one from the Dalai Lama's world, Southeast Asian world, one from the Oregon coast, temperate rainforest, and Salmon River estuary.
That's amazing. A question just came in for Hank about Nels's attitude to the island, about keeping it unnamed and private at first, anonymous, and how that changed over time.
Yeah, he was fierce about keeping that island unnamed. And when The Island Within came out, it was more successful than he dared dream, including Life magazine wanting to run a full excerpt from the book. And when he saw the galleys, they named it. They didn't even name the island, they just named the Tongass. And Nels was so adamant that he said, nope, it's off. You cannot run the piece. And they came around and obscured the geography to his satisfaction, and they ran the piece. But he worked really hard in The Island Within to obscure the town he was in. All mention of where he lived, he wouldn't even say Alaska in his bio. It was just somewhere on the Northwest coast. And when I started this project, I asked him about it because I said, well, how the hell am I going to do this? Am I going to write a biography with fictional geography, or can I name things? And he said if he wrote The Island Within today, he would name everything. And that he'd come around that the best way to protect a landscape is to build a fierce community of human advocates for that particular piece of ground. And I think part of the shift is it felt so wild to him at the time that going from 50 people a year visiting it to 200 was too much to contemplate. But now that there's already 1,000 there, it's about facilitating that community of advocates. So he said, by all means, go ahead and name it.
We made that call here when we were fighting to keep a cyanide heap leach gold mine off the Blackfoot River. What we had to help us was the best fly fishing novella that has ever been written. A River Runs Through It by Norman MacLean. And Redford's movie and the fame of both really changed the demographic of the whole Blackfoot Valley. It became a darling location to a lot of extremely wealthy people from all over the country. Montana really became dear to a lot of Georgians after Ted Turner moved here and that kind of thing, you know. And then it's just always a balancing act between what they're able to protect and what they're not. And I've kind of fallen on the other side of the divide. I never named the rivers in the River Wye, and I don't name the mountain range in Sun House, my forthcoming novel. And I had a natural historian friend read it for inaccuracies, and he immediately named the goddamn mountain range, and I didn't want him to know. And I'm not talking about that. And I told him, shh. But I don't know what I said that was so obvious, and I'm not going to give any clues. But secret and sacred are really closely related words. And there are certain places that I hope everyone can find their own, where you want to keep the waters of the spring pure. And if you get totally caught up in advocacy, as I did, trying to fight to defend the wild salmon of the interior West, which are entering extinction, and the Puget Sound orcas along with them, you need the advocacy. And I was going back to the places I held as deep secrets to see small schools of summer Chinook salmon just about spawned out this time of year, but more than 1,000 miles from Puget Sound, and yet those are the same Chinook salmon that would have kept Tahlequah's infant from dying, so that she had to grieve by carrying it for 17 days and 1,000 miles through all the parts of Puget Sound that had made it impossible for that orca baby to live. And it's just always a hard call.
That tension between secret and sacred, I think, is one that we keep circling around. This spiritual nature of writing, nature writing, and both of you had talked about, I think it was a quote earlier about this generation of spiritual writers, and we had a question about who comprises this next generation of spiritual writers that the two of you are seeing or reading or kind of seeing in the on the horizon of where we need to go.
Hank, do you want to get in trouble?
Here
answer, shall I?
Well, I'll just mention here in Alaska, it's something that's really uplifting is to see the coming together and the gaining of strength of young, indigenous, mostly women leaders, and they some of them write, some of them dance, some of them form nonprofits, some of them change the politics of the whole state, and it's just really encouraging to watch. And I feel like my role is largely just to get the hell out of the way.
We both, yeah.
And I don't for a minute worry about the next generation finding their voice. My daughter, who turned 17 tomorrow, just released yet another political ad. She is just fierce as hell on this campaign to get rid of this. Oh man, I'm just struggling not to use really bad words here. This our current senatorial representative, and these, my daughter generation is burdened by the weight of issues that were nowhere near my awareness when I was 17 years old.
Mm-hmm.
But so many of her generation are rising beneath that weight, and they are finding their voice.
Mm-hmm. My daughters are 27 and 30, and when I'm with them, I just want to sit in the back seat, call me Grampy, let them run the world, please. I am so sick of men of my skin color and age that make me puke. And I spent my life fighting them, and it's just a bummer that I still look like them. Why couldn't I grow some horns or something? but yeah, and getting specifically into writers is tough because there are a lot of them, and there are places to look for them. A couple of good resource books, The Universal Christ by Richard Rohr and Richard Rohr's website. If I start naming a whole bunch of others, I would like to think of different religions besides Catholicism, as Richard himself does. Paul Hawken has a book coming out that is titled something like How to Solve Climate Crisis in One Generation, and it is loaded with people, including one indigenous woman whose piece blew me away. But we've been surreptitiously having a wee dram as the evening has unrolled, and I will not be able to think of her name. So just Paul Hawken's upcoming book, which is written by a whole team of people and is a beautiful piece of work and is true as the work that Paul has spearheaded his entire life, has always been. And I want to shout out to West Virginia writer who was somebody who I worked with on her first novel. Her name's Jessie Van Eerden. Her novel's called Glory Bound, and she has gone on to write some incredible essays about mystical experience and some women mystics, which is a subject dear to me because I'm unearthing a magnificent group of women mystics who lived 7 centuries ago in Europe and completely changed the status of poor people and women who were considered chattel by the all-male hierarchy of the Catholic Church, and had a choice between a nunnery or marriage to some lout, unless they were incredibly lucky. And yeah, so there's a lot of material. Those people were called the Beguines. Their main famous male preacher was Meister Eckhart. And the one who absolutely tilts my needle is, no, I don't want to get that nerdy. We're good. I'll include a bibliography that will either be online or at the end of Sun House, because I reference a huge amount of this material and I don't want it to just disappear because the novel is fiction, because it's fiction. It's based on the best things I know. And I got so sick as an activist writer of being eloquent to people in power who don't give a flying fuck about scientific facts, devastation to the tribes whose money was wild salmon. And eloquence doesn't sell. Those guys have a casino. They've turned the Columbia Snake River into a casino, and they're just going ka-chink, ka-chink, and cashing checks for themselves and turning the whole watershed into a biological desert. And that's a depressing subject, but we'll see whether there's a turnaround here. It really feels like this bad ride is reaching some kind of completely unpredictable climax. That's all I got to say about that.
Well, I think we're nearly out of time for today, but I was just thinking about, as each of you have shared, about this next generation and and then thinking back to each of your relationships with Brian and with Nels, and this the power of intergenerational community and communion and friendship and mentorship, and that in itself gives me a lot of hope, as you know, the millennial in this three stacked conversation here. And I'm wondering if the two of you could just speak to that a little bit about the strength of us working together kind of across these divides. I know Hank, Nels was of older generation, and the two of your friendships bridged that.
The best thing we have going is story. Story is what stirs the imagination. We have to imagine a different future, something we have never lived through before. And so if we all take the role of storytelling seriously, whatever medium we choose, we tell the stories. The voice we have, we find for ourselves, is an amalgam of everything we watch, listen to, and do, the people we are with. So to a certain degree, we have the power to choose our lineage of storytellers. And that speaks to that mentorship, right? And so Nels carved a very unlikely lineage of storytellers. The deer was in there, the bear was in there, Catherine Atliff from the Koyukuk River was there, Wesley Eacock from the Chukchi Sea was there, and then through my apprenticeship to Nels, I am now part of that strange, bizarre lineage. And so it goes, and there's just real beauty in feeling a part of it, and feeling that there's somebody interested in hearing these stories as I age.
Yeah, mentorship is tricky for me, Erica, because my books have been around for a long time, and I can easily be overwhelmed by too many candidates to mentor. But I've been teaching. I've realized that it's really fun to teach outside, and I'm trying to, if we become healthy enough, I want to use rivers as a classroom. Just the danger is that I just can't spread myself too thin, or I'll get nothing done. And at this point, it's easier for me to, well, I don't know. I don't want to get too far into this. Just, I live in an MFA town, and I don't want to be targeted as the guy who helped mentor somebody's book and it got published, because I can't run a program for no pay. And I've never known what to charge for my services. I just occasionally find a manuscript that I love, and I will help one person at a time. And it's not likely that you'll be that person if you send me your manuscript tomorrow. It's just something that's happened. But it's been really rich, and there are people coming up who are writing powerfully about things that are really important. And I too am not worried about your generation. I like your generation better than most of mine, and look forward to what you do. And the way I believe, I'll be somebody's grandchild, in a while. And so I'll see you again, see how it's going.
And Eric, as we're wrapping this up, if there are questions that didn't get aired, I just encourage anybody who's listening now, if you are inclined to get in touch, send me a question. I'll be happy to be in touch. David mentioned in this pandemic time, reaching out is crucial to our well-being. So I'm happy for the connection.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us tonight for this dialogue. I know it was really enriching for me, and thank you to the audience for joining us today as well. And I want to encourage you to check out both Hank and David's books, which are available wherever books are sold, but especially urge you to check out books from your local bookstore, which I know during these times they could really use your support. And we'll be able to send anyone that signed up for this presentation a recording of it after the fact, in case you just want to watch it again or share it with somebody. And David, you'd mentioned Tahlequah, and we actually have another event coming up November 17th from our conservation arm, Braided River. It'll be a dialogue with Seattle Times reporter Linda V. Mapes about the health of our endangered southern resident orca whales of the Salish Sea. So I just wanted to mention that as well. And with that, thank you so much for joining us, everybody. And I hope you have a great rest of your evening. And I think Hank and David and I are off to have another wee dram. So
yeah. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Everyone.
Take care.